our diet currently and what the American Heart Association recommendations are. And then we will talk about some ways of incorporating those. And we'll have just a short kind of stretching break and talk about how to lose the fat, as far as extra fat on our bodies. So we'll talk about, hunger, satiety, the sense of fullness, the appetite hormones, talk about some of those as we go along. And feel free to ask questions or, make comments as we go along. And I might have some questions for you also. So, okay. So this depicts foods, a variety of foods, but many of the foods that we eat are not plainer foods as you see here. They're more complicated. They've been through some technology and they have different added ingredients and different fats. So we'll talk about some of those. So how does fat compare to other macronutrients? And how much fat and what type of fat is part of a healthy intake? Has intake of fat led to excess body weight? And what are essential fatty acids? What are the different components in terms of those fatty acids? And why are they essential in the diet? So the other topics, as I mentioned before, will deal with appetite and satiety, the sense of fullness, the role of the environment. You'll be here all night. Caloric density, and then, you've lost the weight, so what's next? What are some of the tips from the National Weight Control Registry as far as keeping weight off? So one of the things to be aware of always is that fat is the most concentrated source of calories. Carbohydrate, even though it gets kind of a bad rap, especially right now, really has less calories than fat does at 4 calories per gram, and protein is 4 calories per gram. Fat is 9, alcohol is 7. So, and many foods are really a combination of all three. So when someone says, well, I'm on a low carb diet, so I'm not eating cookies, the next person could say, I'm on a low fat diet, so I'm not eating as many cookies. And I think we tend to make diets sort of black and white, like low carb is the latest, or high carb, or one of the others. But really, food is much more complex than that, and usually contains more than one nutrient. And in fact, that is one of the things that makes foods more appealing. I mean, think about if you had a stick of butter, it might not taste that great, just in and of itself. Or if you had a bowl of sugar, yeah, that's okay, but is it that great? But combine the two, it's wonderful. And it's hard to stop eating it. And there are some addictive properties of food that we're only now starting to become more aware of. So this is from the CDC. It's based on data from behavior risk factors, the surveillance information, the surveys that are done. And it really kind of depicts how, as a nation, well, not only our country, but really around the world, people continue to get heavier and heavier. And this is the percent of the adult population who has a body mass index of 30 or more. So this would be a body mass index, which would be equivalent to the comment obesity, and I hate that word, but that's the way it is in the nomenclature. And it's based on the weight in kilograms over the height in meters squared. That's how they come up with that. And just a comment about BMI. It's great when you look at population trends using BMI, but it's not quite as helpful for individuals because it doesn't take into account whether you're a man or a woman, you're all grouped together. And, men naturally have more muscle, and so they weigh more. It doesn't take into consideration the composition of your body and so on. But it is one measure, and I'd like to know what those people in Colorado are doing. They're, seem to be a lot more active, so keeping the weight off. Also, I think too, this is, and you've probably read this also, that the story goes, well, Americans were told that they needed to cut down on fat. And then what happened was they increased carbohydrate, and that's the reason for the weight gain. But if you actually look at the data, it is true that we're eating more carbohydrate, but we are eating more fat also. And so you see that starch consumption has gone up, like from grain products, but fat consumption has gone up also. And calories have gone up from about 2,000 calories, 2,050 calories a day, to about 2,450 calories a day. So it's made a big difference. But when you think about it, if people are eating more carbohydrate, they're not having pizza without cheese, they're not having bagels without cream cheese, they're not having toast without peanut butter. Things tend to go together like that. So you increase one, tend to increase another, not exclusively. So that's kind of an interesting phenomena. This depicts our intake of certain food groups over a period of time, looking at it from 1970 and going up to 2010. And you can see that meat, eggs, and nuts have been fairly consistent, as has dairy. And the really skinny lines for vegetables and fruits, we don't eat enough of those really skinny lines. Of course, it's a percent of, or it's a representation of calories from those. So it really shows that, they don't have many calories is what it shows. But also, despite the encouragement to increase servings of fruits and vegetables, we're not really doing that. Flour and cereal products have trended upward. I think if you were to look beyond the 2010, you'd see that a little bit more. And then added fats and oils and dairy fats are in this next group. But it's interesting, our increase in fats isn't necessarily coming from saturated fats, and that's a good thing. But we're eating more avocado, we're eating more nuts, we're consuming more oils. And so probably the biggest change that is happening with that is just the fact that it's leading to more calories. It's a healthy fat, and if you can afford the fat, that's not going to be detrimental to you. But if it's extra calories, it's still going to be calories. So it also points out to the fact that some foods develop kind of a healthy halo. Like I think avocados have a healthy halo. Olive oil has a healthy halo. You watch a cooking show and you watch the olive oil glug, 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 and I just think, wow, that's a lot of calories, So in any case, some of this is a reflection of that. And this is from 1970, total calories per person, 2064, and now it's about around 2,400. So these are some of the risks associated with diabetes. The one thing that I've noticed is that this list continues to get longer and longer, even to certain types of cancer. So why do we have this excess weight? Sometimes I think it's interesting to step back and really look at our lifestyle and how it's changed and how this has led to more weight. We eat out quite a lot. In fact, just last year, the money spent on dining out exceeded the money that we spent on groceries. So I know it's kind of hard to believe because, some people don't eat out at all. Some people eat out every day. I've had patients who eat fast food every day. It's just handy. No one told them that it wasn't necessarily the best thing for them, but it's sometimes cheaper, more handy for them to get to. And also, I think as we become a little bit more isolated, more people live alone, meeting someone for dinner, going out for coffee, it's more of a social event. So, but the only thing to have some precautionary attitude about is that portions are often larger when you go out to eat. And it's not so much that like one meal is a larger meal that's going to throw everything off. But if you go out to eat a lot and you're served larger portions, you begin to think that that's a normal portion. So your sense of what is appropriate for you changes. It starts becoming larger. It's just like I was talking to a patient one day and I said, yeah, well, that serving, it's a portion that's too large for you. But that's what they served me. I know, but it's too big for you. So we kept going around and around and around. So, what we consider normal can kind of get distorted by doing that. Also, we have what one author described as a compulsion completion when it comes to foods. It's kind of an extension of the Clean Plate Club, but it also, again, is an extension of what we think is normal. And there have been some experiments done where people who just ate a meal were served popcorn, and it wasn't even really great popcorn. It was day-old, partially stale popcorn. But one serving was like a medium-sized container of popcorn, and the other was a giant size. And both groups ate about 2/3 of what it was. So we're influenced by those portions. And then you look at, wow, going to Sam's Club. If you have a family of 12, that's great. But anyway, but just gigantic amounts of food that you see. So sugary beverages, and it's not just soda. It's coffee, beverages that have a lot of added syrup and toppings to them. Even some sports beverages, they don't have as many calories as soda, but they still have calories. Juices, and sometimes it's just interesting to go up and down the food aisles and see what we are eating, like a whole bank of pizza, and I just remember this one time, speaking of pizza, there's a blizzard warning in Duluth, and so I went to the grocery store, and the pizza aisle was just demolished. It was just ravaged. I mean, it was like people didn't have any food at home, and it was only a one-day event. So in any case, and there's also, I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's also a lot more frozen food that's geared to single portions, a lot more on the lean cuisine, healthy choice, really lots of options that people have. Healthier food can cost more, and I think people have to make some comparisons if they're on a budget, especially regarding fresh produce and so on. For example, apples can vary from, about $1.60 a pound to Honeycrisp at $3.60, and so things really vary a lot. And I think it is possible to eat well even on a limited budget, but you have to pick and choose a little bit more. And you do pay for the convenience, and you pay for the extra processing in some of these items. promotion of snack foods, about 30% of our calories or so now comes from snacks. So we eat quite a number of calories that way, and I think we have a generation of children who are growing up to eat more snack foods too. So they are especially tasty and part of the normal diet. We have desserts and dessert-like foods. For example, if you look at muffins, not so many years ago, muffins were, they were small. They were, like, I don't know, an ounce and a half or so. And now they're huge. And they have a lot more sugar and a lot more fat than muffins did years ago. They're really more like cupcakes. And so what we have in the food supply has changed a lot. Okay, now it's your turn. So this is about a 2,000 calorie meal. So this would be, for many people, more than what they should have for the whole day. But here's my question for you. This is a 12-inch sandwich. The equivalent of how many slices of bread would that be? 6. Yeah. 6 slices of bread. That's a lot. Yeah. And many cookies are 400 calories just because they're so large. Sometimes it's hard to find a smaller cookie. And the chips, and the juice, that adds another, in that size, about 250 calories. So, and when it comes to drinking calories, our brain doesn't register those as calories. So we tend to eat that equivalent amount of food. So the calories from juices and other beverages like that just become extra calories. So, yeah.
Why is that?
I don't know exactly. We don't think of them in the same way. It might be partly psychological, or it might be our sense of fullness that we didn't chew those foods that it has something to do with that too. I think it's interesting though, like when people are trying to gain weight, like a patient with cancer, ravaged with cancer trying to gain weight, what do we give them? We give them Ensure. We give them things to drink. It's just a lot easier to get calories in that way. So, yeah. Great question. Thanks. So finally, we're at fats. All these different types of fats: saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, trans fats, omega-3 fatty acids. So here we go into chemistry and biochemistry. And people will say, well, you remember from chemistry class. And I always think, I don't want to remember much from chemistry class. I remember Bunsen burners, 100 of them going in the summer in a lab. But in any case, so when we talk about something being a saturated fat or a monounsaturated fat, what we're really talking about are these fatty acid chains. Fats all have this glycerol portion that you see on the end, and then they have chains of varying lengths. So there are short chain fatty acids, maybe 4 to 6 carbons, so it's a hydrocarbon. There are medium chain fatty acids and there are long chain fatty acids. Many of the long chain fatty acids are polyunsaturated fats. But what does that really mean? When a fat is saturated, what does that mean? I was just curious. Does anybody know that?
It doesn't pick up free radicals.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah. Carbon is happy when it's bonded, when it has 4 bonds. So you see these carbons in a row and they have hydrogen above and below. So they have 4 bonds that way. They are saturated with hydrogen. As many hydrogens as can attach are attached here. So in a chemical way, that's what defines a saturated fat. And there's a lot of different ones. And that's one of the things that I think some active research is going on. And for example, is the saturated fat in coconut oil. Is it better than the saturated fat in butter? The research doesn't show that, but it doesn't mean that, in the future, we might see a change in that. But so far, despite all the promotion, there aren't good longer-term studies to show that it is better. And sometimes people say, well, people take in a lot of coconut oil, they live longer and they're healthier. But you have to look at the whole picture too. There might be individuals who are at a good weight for height and they eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and they have a lower saturated fat intake as far as other parts of their diet. So it's not ever very simple when it comes to describing that. Unsaturated fatty acids, on the other hand, here you still see the carbons with 4 bonds, but they don't have the hydrogens as part of that bonding as far as the linkage is concerned. So they have double bonds. So monounsaturated fat, 1 double bond. Polyunsaturated fats, many double bonds. And to complicate it just a little bit more, most of the fats that we talk about as being one way or another, like saying that butter is mostly a saturated fat, or we think of butter as a saturated fat, but it really has some other fats in it also. So there's rarely, just a pure fat because of the different fatty acids. It exists with a combination of fats, but it's often one or another has more predominance to it. So essential fatty acids are important in our diet, and fats in general are important in our diet because they help our cell membranes. They help in preserve the membranes that we should have and keep cell membranes more fluid. They're a part of our brain makeup. Fats are. They can insulate our organs in the body. They help keep us warm, and they are, a source of calories in famine. So then there are essential fatty acids, and these make up just a really small percentage of the diet. These primarily come from plants. So good sources of essential fatty acids would be walnuts, also nuts in general, soybean oil, soybeans. Those are good sources of essential fatty acids. It's very rare in a free living population to have an essential fatty acid deficiency, but it has occurred in other situations. For example, infants who were only fed skim milk, they developed this, dermatitis and the, hair falling out and the dry, scaly skin. Things that I have in the winter. No, I'm just, but anyway. So they developed an essential fatty acid deficiency. And in a hospital setting, if someone is on total parenteral nutrition, when total parenteral nutrition was first started, it was only carbohydrate and fat. You might remember that as a dietitian way back then, or when. Anyway, and then fats were added later. So so people developed fatty acid deficiency. It takes a while for it to happen, but there have been cases like it. But you don't need very much fat in the diet to have essential fatty acids. So another fat that is really important is the omega-3 fatty acids that you find primarily in fish. And this is starting with the lowest to the highest. And the recommendation is to have 2 fish meals a week. So in order to get more of these omega-3 fatty acids. And they're thought to be more heart protective, so including them in a regular basis in our diet is a good idea. And during pregnancy to include them also, because they're important in brain development, but not too much, and only certain kinds of fish. Monounsaturated fats also include nuts, avocado, canola oil, olive oil, peanut butter. So these are all considered healthy kinds of fats to include in the diet. Saturated fats raise blood cholesterol and increase LDL cholesterol. Now you always hear about LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol. Cholesterol is cholesterol, but how it's carried in those lipoproteins determines what happens to it. So LDL, a low-density lipoprotein, is more likely to lead to depositing that cholesterol in your arteries and forming plaques, whereas high-density lipoproteins tend to scavenge the cholesterol and get rid of it, so it's not available for that plaque formation. So having a high-density, or as one cardiologist said, think healthy, high-density lipoprotein is better than proteins or lousy. So that's why, we used to look at total cholesterol as the end all, but now we really look at what is your LDL level, what is your HDL level, what's your triglyceride level, and so on. And some of that has a genetic component to it, but some of it is related to diet and exercise and weight also. Yeah. So these are fats that are usually hard or solid at room temperature. For example, you can set out a stick of butter and it still retains its shape. That's the saturated fat in it. There are some plant sources also, coconut oil, palm kernel oil. And unfortunately, the fat in chocolate is a saturated fat. So, okay. So, just some sources of saturated fat. And then trans fats. So, trans fats start out as being unsaturated fats, and then hydrogen is added to them in the presence of a catalyst. And they become, so some hydrogens are added, and some of these hydrogens are across from one another, whereas in other situations, the hydrogens would be on the same side. So that's where the trans comes in, that they're across from each other. So trans fatty acids are especially damaging. And it's interesting because the whole process was invented by someone who won the Nobel Prize years and years ago. But the reason it was used so much in our diet over a period of time was because it preserved food well. It didn't become rancid like some other fats would. And it also created more of that, the hardness and plasticity of fats. So it worked well in a lot of products. But studies were done and determined that it really did lead to more heart disease. So the FDA, over a period of time, has been recommending and creating laws to gradually phase out the use of trans fats in the diet. So if you see labels though that say 0 trans fat, they are still allowed to have up to 0.5 grams of trans fatty acids. So if you wanted to avoid them even more, avoid foods that have partially hydrogenated fats in them. So, okay. And the reason I said historically is that you know, a lot of cookies and fried foods, crackers and so on, now are virtually trans fat free. So they have to be. So, yeah. Okay. Talked about that. So, yeah, we covered most of that. So this is in your outline, but a brief history of trans fats. Um, so these are some of the American Heart Association recommendations. They're current ones. Pretty basic. Use up at least as many calories as you take in. You know, it's pretty easy. Increase physical activity, aiming for at least 150 minutes of moderate activity each week. So looking at, you know, 30 minutes, 5 days a week. And in the diabetes prevention program, in the first study that was done with that, you know, and which eventually showed that 58% of people were able to reduce their chance of developing type 2 diabetes. You know, basically they lost 7% of body weight and exercised 150 minutes a week. So that became the basis of that program for that. Don't smoke and avoid secondhand smoke. Eat less of foods that are nutrient poor. Cut back on beverages and food with added sugars. And aim to eat no more than about 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, which is difficult since, especially if a person eats any processed foods, because 80% of the sodium that we get is in processed foods. So it's not what, you know, you're adding from the salt shaker. It's there already. Yeah. Limit saturated and trans fats and replace them with the better fats whenever you can, whenever it's possible. So eat a dietary pattern that includes a variety of fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy, skinless poultry and fish, those 2 fish meals, nuts, legumes as part of the diet, non-tropical vegetable oils, all part of it. So as far as the actual fat intake recommendations, they're given as a % of calories, which is sort of confusing in a way. But it used to be kind of right off the bat, they talk about 30% of calories from fat. But now it's more of a range, partly because we have food fats that are better in our diet. So having more calories from fat, if you can afford those calories, is not a bad thing. So eating more nuts, if that's, you know, part of what you enjoy, it's not a bad fat. You could easily do that. Here's an example of how that would play out. So 1,500 calories, that would give you a total of about 50 grams of fat. If you had 1,800 calories, it would be about 60 grams of fat for the whole day. And that would be, you know, added fats, fats that are already present in foods, and limit saturated fats. The American Heart Association, they used to have 10% saturated fats, and then they went down to 7, and now it's 5 to 6% of saturated fats. So that's really pretty low. So that means, for example, if you're eating 1,500 calories, saturated fat less than 12 grams. So that gives you something to really evaluate a product with. So if you're looking at a label and you see, okay, this tablespoon of butter has 7 grams of saturated fat. Is that how I want to use up my saturated fat? I do when I make cookies at Christmas, but or there are foods that don't have labels but still have a lot of saturated fat. For example, fresh meat is not required to have a nutrition facts label the way we understand it. So that's why it's important to know, you know, what are the higher fat containing meats, because a fair amount of that fat, not all of it, but a fair amount of that fat can come from a saturated fat. So those are a couple big sources. Other sources where sometimes there isn't a label is if you go to a bakery and you get a single cookie, or 3 or 4, and they are not required to have a nutrition facts label either. And there can be, a lot of fat in the larger pastries and bakery items. So those are some, more hidden sources of fat. Dairy products. We are a culture that eats a lot of cheese. Just really, we have cheese on everything. Molten cheese on sandwiches, and everything's better with cheese. So that's a big. Yeah, people are nodding their heads. That's a big source of saturated fat in the diet. Regular cheese has about 8 grams of fat per ounce. And so even thinking about it in terms of how it leads to the total fat, how that increases, and then a big portion of that is going to be saturated. So those are some of the higher ones. Can you think of any others that you consider to be high? Okay. Yeah. Ice cream. Let's not forget ice cream. So premium ice cream is quite high in saturated fat. If you went out and got regular ice cream, not a premium ice cream, and were able to limit it to a half a cup, you would maybe get 3 grams of saturated fat. So yeah, you would use up, a quarter of your saturated fat for the day, but at least you wouldn't be having ice cream that has 8 grams of saturated fat in it. So the, portion makes a big difference. I know I've spent a lot of time looking at labels of ice cream, not for patients, for myself, but, well, it has this many calories and this much saturated fat. But
what about frozen yogurt?
Yeah, there you go. 0 grams fat, 0 grams saturated fat. Yeah. But then what happens is you have more sugar, you have more carb. It's always kind of that trade-off. So, but yeah, definitely a way to cut back on the saturated fat. So it makes me wonder too where the American Heart Association will be in the future. I mean, it keeps going down in terms of saturated fat. So, yeah. So one should also consider the style of eating and the type of diet overall. So some really good diets that incorporate all of these things would be the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet, and also a diet using glycemic index, glycemic load, that would incorporate many of the things I talked about earlier. And I would just like to touch on the Mediterranean diet a little bit because I think it does such a good job of enabling people to live out those recommendations in a really enjoyable way. So our knowledge of the Mediterranean diet first came about through a scientist named Dr. Ansel Keys. And he was a scientist at the University of Minnesota in the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene. And he noticed that after World War II, many men in the United States were dying of heart disease. And he compared it to in other parts of the world, people weren't dying of heart disease at the same kind of rate. So he did a famous study called the 7-country study and compared it around the world, the incidence of heart disease and death, and found that people who lived in these Mediterranean countries tended to have less incidence of heart disease. So then he subsequently, subsequent to that study, there were other studies done. Recently, there's been an attack of his research, saying that he kind of cherry-picked those studies to show what he wanted them to show. And then there was a front page article in the Wall Street Journal about that. And he's kind of my hero a little bit, so I was like so dismayed. But then there was a whole backlash of letters to the editor saying, no, he was right. This is this, written by cardiologists and other people. The one thing I will say is that following his research, there were many other studies that basically showed the same kind of thing. There was multiple risk factor intervention trial, and there was the Hale study, and there was, in more recent time, the Predimed study that made all the papers, and that really showed that Mediterranean diet was a more healthy way to go. So I don't think we've heard the end of it, but did any of you read things about that, like saying we should be okay eating saturated fat now? Or?
I've heard things about that.
Yeah. So it's a story I think that
Full fat
really,
dairy and
that
sort of thing. And
Yeah.
then the whole paleo thing, which is a lot of meat.
Yeah.
Is a lot. That's, you gotta have, you're gonna get saturated fat if you're increasing your meat.
Yep. So I don't think we've heard the end of it. I think it's something that we're still going to have studies about, and people are going to be arguing about. And of course, there's a lot at stake. It's not only scientific recommendations that are at stake, but it's also the food industry. My goodness, they follow all these trends really, really closely. Labeling products as no trans fats when they never had any trans fats to start with, and things like that. So in any case, so here's the Mediterranean diet, and I brought a book that we'll take just a teeny break after this, but if you wanted to look at this book, it is amazing. It shows the cuisine in many types of Mediterranean countries, and has just beautiful pictures and not that many ingredients in the recipes, but the presentation, it just makes them look so delicious. It reminds me of going to California to visit my sister and having fruits and vegetables there. And I remember thinking, everybody would eat fruits and vegetables if they tasted like this, and they were so wonderful and so fresh. So, but DASH diet, now you have the Mediterranean solution DASH diet. But, Mediterranean countries are not just southern Italy. There are a lot of other countries as well. And it's more than olive oil, but it is inspired by traditional diet patterns from Greek island of Crete, other parts of Greece, Morocco, Spain. But but they have different cuisines, but they have common elements of their cuisines. More fruits and vegetables, less meat. And these healthier types of diets were originally thought of as kind of food of the poor, where the people who lived in these areas ate more things like beans and lentils and so on, because they couldn't afford meat. They couldn't afford a richer diet. So that was, part of it. And not only people live in the Mediterranean areas, but I think across the world, people aspire to a more Americanized diet, given the chance, or I shouldn't say that because we're kind of a melting pot and have different cuisines, but we tend to eat a diet that's fairly high overall in meat and fairly rich and, fairly high in some of these fats that I talked about. So if given a choice, that's a way of eating that most people prefer if that is the situation. So, but in southern Italy, they use more garlic, peppers, rich, savory, strongly flavored ingredients, more tomato, somewhat spicy. In Greece, it's more like cucumber, honey, olive oil, more tangy with citrus accents to it. And in Morocco, more exotic, and here we see the tangine. I have one of those at home. I use it for decoration. I've yet to actually use it, but it's beautiful. And it's a kind of a casserole-like dish that you put in the oven. Any of you used it? Have you seen it? Interesting. Yeah. But exotic and strong flavors, not necessarily spicy, but I'm fascinated with their combination of spices. Yeah. Also, traditionally they have a relaxing setting that promotes physical activity. And this is, maybe a part of, why people live longer. Ansel Keys lived to be over 100, and he spent his last days in Italy. And his wife lived that long too. Yeah. So lifestyle, just a normal part of the day to move around and just be more active. And and it's interesting too that in addition to recommending the at least 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, now scientists recommend that we take breaks from sitting. So we're going to do that in a little bit. So about every hour, to stand up and walk around. And I think so many of us have lifestyles, or we have jobs where we sit all day. I mean, even my job, I used to be able to be at the hospital, and to look at a chart, I'd have to go up to a floor. I'd have to walk steps and get up there and walk down the halls. Now it's all on a computer. I mean, I go up there to visit patients and so on, but you don't make extra trips. It's all there, right there. It's all the electronic medical record. And so, to some extent, there've been some articles about the Mediterranean diet, this healthy diet, as being in extinction as they adopt more of the Americanized diet of fast foods and trans fats, and some of the same kind of problems that we have: the childhood obesity, diabetes, high cholesterol, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, all of those things. But it is a beautiful diet to behold. And with that, we are leaving the Mediterranean area. We're going to take like a 5-minute stretch break, and then we're going to come back and talk about appetite, and we'll be on this period. So, yeah.